Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this evening's program on a roundtable about documenting Black American material culture. I'm Sarah Duggan. I'm the coordinator and research curator of the Decorative Arts of the Gulf South Project here at the Historic New Orleans Collection. And this program is in conjunction with the current exhibition here at the collection, Pieces of History, 10 Years of Decorative Arts Fieldwork. And this program really began thinking about, so this program is about material culture, new research happening in the South. DAGS, or as was formerly known, the Classical Institute of the South, is focused on documenting historic objects that were made or used in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama prior to 1865. And that's ongoing research. We're always finding new things to document. We have 2 summer fellows coming in about 2 weeks. And I wanted to highlight some other similar projects or scholars here in the region who are also doing really innovative work in the area of African American history and material culture. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists this evening. So first we have Dr. Tara Dudley, who's a historic preservation consultant and a lecturer at the University of Texas at Austin School of Architecture. She obtained her doctorate in architectural history and a master's degree in historic preservation from UT Austin. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in art history from Princeton University. And Dr. Dudley's research focuses on 19th and early 20th century American architecture and design, specifically the undertold and untold contributions of African Americans. Her book, Building Antebellum New Orleans, Free People of Color and Their Influence, will be released by the University of Texas Press in August of 2021. She's currently writing a biography on African-American architect John Saunders Chase. And we also have Joe Mcgill, who is a history consultant for Magnolia Plantation in Charleston, South Carolina, and the founder and director of the Slave Dwelling Project. By arranging for people to sleep in extant slave dwellings, the Slave Dwelling Project has brought much needed attention to these often neglected structures that are vitally important to the American built environment. Mr. Mcgill also participates in parades, living history presentations, lectures, and battlefield reenactments as a Civil War reenactor. Previously, as a field officer for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Mr. Mcgill worked to revitalize the Sweet Auburn Commercial District in Atlanta, Georgia, and to develop a management plan for the Mississippi Delta National Heritage Area. He's a former executive director of the African American Museum in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and a former director of history and culture at Penn Center, St. Helena Island, South Carolina. He has also served as a National Park Service park ranger at Fort Sumter National Monument in Charleston. And lastly, we have Dr. Tiffany Momon, who's a public historian and assistant professor at Sewanee, the University of the South, with years of experience participating in the preservation of community histories. Her work has taken her throughout the Southeast, organizing community-based historic preservation projects in locations such as Winston-Salem, North Carolina, the Alabama Black Belt, and the Kentucky segments of the Trail of Tears. Moman is the founder and co-director of the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, a Black digital humanities project that centers Black craftspeople, their lives, and their contributions to the making and building of America. Throughout her career, Moman has lectured on the subject of Black craftspeople at organizations such as the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts, the Museum of the Winterthur Museum, Garden Library, and the Daughters of the American Revolution Museum, and others. Just want to thank all of you for being here with us this evening. I know you're all busy with your own projects, so we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. And say all of your work has inspired and challenged me in my own research. So I'm excited to speak with and learn from all of you. So to get started, you could so I've read your bios, but if you could tell us just a little bit more about what got you interested in the field that you study, whether it was early experiences in museums, research you did as part of your education. How did you kind of end up with what you're doing today? And why don't we start with you, Tara?
I knew you were going to start with me.
You're first in the alphabet. So.
Yes, exactly. And you said brief, so I'll try to keep my journey simple. But once upon a time, I wanted to be an interior designer. And ultimately in my college studies, ended up pursuing an undergraduate degree in art history. That being said, I didn't want to be a curator per se or a registrar or anything like that. At that time, I wasn't interested in pursuing a career in academia either, which is kind of funny at present. And so moving from internships and other things at various art museums, including the Cooper Hewitt and the Met, I ended up at an internship at Shadows on the Teche, which is a national trust for historic preservation site in New Iberia, Louisiana, essentially neighboring my hometown of Lafayette, Louisiana. I had never been to the site, to the historic site, which was interesting. And so I'm here in this graduate internship, even though I wasn't in graduate school at that point. And it was at that time that I learned that I could do such thing as pursue a career in historic preservation. And so that brought me to graduate school. And I ultimately ended up, after looking at several institutions, at the University of Texas at Austin, where I pursued first a master's degree in historic preservation and then pursued the PhD in architectural history. And for me, that has allowed me to continue my interest in art history and that manner of looking at things and being involved with material culture, my interest in historic interiors, and then opening that up more broadly to historic preservation and public history. And the various projects that I do now, whether as a consultant for about 15 years, I was a historic preservation consultant at a firm that is based in Austin and worked on all sorts of projects all over the place, while at the time also working as a teaching assistant and then ultimately teaching a few classes in the University of Texas of Architecture, or University of Texas at Austin School of Architecture. And so that's the short story of where I am now and how I got interested in the things that I'm interested in studying.
Great, thank you. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention, we will have some time for questions and answers at the end of the program. But if you think of a question while our panelists are speaking, feel free to put it in that Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. All right, so yes, Joe, you're next in alphabetical order. Can you tell us a little bit about what got you into the reenacting historical interpretation you do?
Yeah, it's I think it's a means of controlling anger control, if you will. In the fact that being educated in South Carolina, the history of South Carolina, and of course being educated at a time shortly after the integration or desegregation of schools, where the schools were desegregated, but the curriculum was not, and learning of a history that glorified that we've revised, a revisionist history, if you will, that glorified their Southern cause, in a history that interpreted enslaved people as being happy, or enslavers as being benevolent, and learning otherwise, that this was not the real history of these United States, and visiting sites, being an employee of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and visiting sites that they preserve, and they do a good job at preserving them. But it's usually those sites or those places that are iconic, the house on the hill. And when you search or delve into the real history, you get the history of the people who I share my DNA with. And that was not a part of the narrative, as some of these nice, beautiful, historically significant sites that people could go and visit on a daily basis. Well, knowing that the structures are there that can tell our stories, even the nice, beautiful houses that the people admire, our stories can be told through that structure. In other words, who built that? Who physically built it? They weren't the architects, but they physically built it. They cut down those trees. That's now that house. They made those bricks. That's now that house. Their labor was stolen for that house to exist. And because those things were not in the narrative, it inspired me to, well, first it angered me. So you can use anger for good or evil. And my good of all this was creating the Slave Dwelling Project, seeking from these stewards of these places permission to come and spend the night in these spaces. I was drawing on my experience being a Civil War reenactor and going to Civil War battlefields and reenacting battles. But the opportunity there was the opportunity to spend nights at these historic sites. So I kind of applied that same idea to these historic sites. And now, 11 years later, 25 states later, and the District of Columbia, I'm still at it.
That's great. All right. And then Tiffany, can you tell us a little bit about what got you into your current studies and the inspiration for starting the digital archive as well?
Sure. So I left a job in corporate America and I went back to graduate school. And I went to graduate school at Middle Tennessee State University, where I joined the Center for Historic Preservation. And so all along, I was focused on buildings and landscapes and very historic preservation minded. But then one summer, I went to the Summer Institute at the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. And that summer, it really sort of changed the way that I approached the study of material culture. One thing that stuck with me throughout that summer was that I never liked the way that decorative arts approached the study of Black craftspeople. It was always very broad, just very general. And then I went back to that same Summer Institute 2 years later, and I did it all over again. But this time, I was my summer project was on a man named John Quash Williams, who was a master carpenter and joiner in Charleston in the 18th century. And from studying John Williams's life, studying some of the events that you don't think would happen to a Black person at that time. For example, him receiving a royal land grant from the South Carolina governor, who also happened to be his next door neighbor. So it was just a story that it was almost as if, it's such a good story. It almost felt like fiction sometimes. But tracing him around the city of Charleston led me to begin tracing the men that he worked with around the city of Charleston. And then from there, I was like, well, if I could do it with this set of 9 men, who else can I do it for? And so from there, I began looking at advertisements seeking the return of self-emancipated individuals, and I began plotting locations associated with those individuals on maps, the sites where they were enslaved. And then that's in a nutshell, led to the creation of the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive. But what's behind all of that is just me being, I guess, fed up at that point with how museums completely disregarded the Black makers behind the objects that we all enjoy.
Yeah, I love how, you and Joe are both taking your frustration and channeling it into doing something really innovative in the field. That's fantastic. And I also love how we have historic preservation so well represented. I feel like buildings are a theme in everybody's work here. And I guess so we've talked about buildings a little bit. What are some other sources or artifacts that are really key in your research, and how does studying physical objects enhance our understanding of the past beyond just the documentary record? Yeah, feel free to jump in.
I would say for me, I use physical objects as evidence, right? Evidence of the presence of people. When you pick up an object, let's say it's a silver coffee pot, right? You can spin so many stories from that particular object about the person who made it, where was the silver mined, and also about the person who cared for it, who cleaned it, who put the coffee in it, who served the coffee. And so that's one of the things that I really enjoy about material culture studies is using objects as evidence to tell a story, an American history story.
Yes, I agree with that. You can look at an object and develop various stories of various people who would have handled that object, can derive from that object. It's like looking at things that are unpleasant sometimes. Sometimes that's a branding iron or a whip. That story has that object has a story nonetheless. as it applies to the enslaved and the enslavers. In all, we know that, the stories that it tells makes us uncomfortable, but they should still be a part of the narrative nonetheless.
Absolutely. Just the object itself allows you to tell that more diverse story, and of people, whether they are enslaved or free, Black or white, or of other races or ethnicities, of a time period, and just the various touch points of when and how people interacted with that space, from the raw material to the making of that substance, or object or furnishing, as the case might be for many of the things that I study or teach about. And it just broadens that story for me, and allows you to maybe get at some of the stories that you might not see in a textbook, that aren't necessarily readily available, even in the document, in an archival, letter, or, bill of sale, or something else like that you're looking at. And so, and from, just the time that it was used, maybe at its height, then what does that mean for the object and for the people who were looking at it, and why they're looking at it after its major, primary period of use? Why do we select certain objects to place in museums or historic houses? How we look at them, and then teach about them and that history, and the individuals who use them after a certain point of period, or a certain point of time, and into the present day. So I think different kinds of objects, as we've all said, are really important to get at some of those stories, and increasingly the people. For me, among the material culture that I look at the most are buildings, since I'm an architectural historian. But increasingly, it's been just as important for me to think about the brick or the wood or the mortar or the space itself, as much as the inhabitants of that space at various points in time, and who's living in that space, how they're using it, and how those stories are then expressed in that space or place as well.
Yeah, Tara, I remember hearing you speak at a different conference earlier this year about, you can see the fingerprints of people in the bricks, the enslaved people who made those bricks. And that's just a kind of record that you can't replace that. That's so powerful.
Yeah, and just giving, those people a certain amount of agency, especially if we're talking about the construction of a space. We usually speak about architecture and buildings in very passive terms, like Tara built that, even though she was the person that paid for it. I didn't build it with my hands. I'm an architectural historian. If I tried to build something, it would fall down. And so thinking about the actual hands who in many cases made the brick, the hands who quarried the stone, in addition to constructing the building. And most of the time, it's those, we don't even know who those people are. We might have a number. Usually we don't have a name. And so there's no way to identify those people. And so sometimes that structure becomes the only way of identifying them, and having some kind of physical connection to those people, where in some cases we don't even have a building contract or a subcontractor's agreement, or like I said, a bill of sale if it's an enslaved person, and owners, or enslavers record of those individuals. So that material, it serves another purpose, even beyond some of the things that we just discussed. So definitely.
Yes, and looking at the bricks, if you want to apply that same concept to hand-hewn structures or hand-hewn logs, if you see those tool marks where they struck, chances are that that tool was being used by an enslaved person.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And that was a good point you made, Tara, how sometimes you do hit a dead end and you can't find specific information about a person involved with an object. I know with the livery coat that we currently have on display in the exhibition, I have tried to find the name of the enslaved young man who might have worn it, and there's no inventory I can look at. But let's say if you do find something in the documentary record, or maybe if our audience is curious about doing some of this research themselves, what are some kinds of documents that help enhance your understanding of physical objects?
Well, there are, if you look at runaway ads, which were quite common, enslaved people are described well. Sometimes you know better how that enslaved person looked than the person who owned him or her, because they're going to describe for you what they were wearing. You know, they may have been wearing that coat that you're trying to, find the provenance of. And so that's something that's something to interpret. Now, another angle that you can use in trying to figure out what this coat is or who it belonged to is, you can look into the records of organizations like the Brooks Brothers, companies like the Brooks Brothers, because they may have been the maker of that coat if it was for a butler or a coachman. The Brooks Brothers were involved.
Yeah, they actually were. Yes, we do know that. It's got a label.
Oh, see,
so we know Dr. William Newton Mooser owned it. He bought it from Brooks Brothers.
There it is.
That's what I have so far. But yeah,
that's the connection. That's that connection right there. And another thing is the archival material that exists. We have to look at them differently. In this letter that the mistress of the house or the enslaver may have composed to someone. He may have talked about an incident with an enslaved person. Maybe they had to dish out some discipline. Maybe they had to sell a family member or a whole family for that matter. Maybe the ends didn't meet. In these letters, these enslaved people are mentioned by name, first name. That's all they got. But also, you can look at the census records of that period. They didn't usually name them, but they enumerated them. That's something. That's material that can be used to insert the enslaved people into the narrative.
Absolutely. You mentioned one thing that I was going to talk about is the slave schedules in the U.S. federal census and the numbers of enslaved individuals, and particularly if you're looking at enslavers who had as their property a significant number of males of a certain age, and that these men were master builders or contractors, then it goes without saying that many of those enslaved men would have likely been involved in the building of any the actual work that any of these enslavers were pursuing in the course of their careers as architects or master builders in the antebellum era. So that's definitely one method that I've used to kind of get at these individuals or the stories behind them, and looking closely at some of the relationships with other builders and knowing if individuals were enslavers and were in the practice of perhaps hiring out people, enslaved men, usually men, for crafts purposes, building purposes, is another way that I've utilized to learn more about individuals. But my methods have been varied based on the project or what it is that I'm trying to find, because I've used everything from census records, from account records where they exist, building contracts, and so on and so forth. So it really just kind of depends on the project for me. And increasingly, it's sort of like a game of detective almost that gets really fun and creative, and making the connections between individuals or events where I very often find information about craftsmen, Black craftsmen in the antebellum area, especially in enslaved craftsmen. It's definitely easier if I'm looking at information about free people, and most notably my research on the free people of color, but still in looking at the tremendous archives in New Orleans at places like the Historic New Orleans Collection, at the Notarial Archives that have been around for years. And for forever, since the founding of the city of New Orleans, but not having accessed those documents in a very specific way to extract that information. But that has allowed me to get at some of the stories and narratives that I've pursued over the past few years.
And I would second, agree with all of those approaches. One thing that's helped me with the BCDA is I actually read those 18th century newspapers because I'm looking for very specific things. And the thing I love about old newspapers was that everybody put their business in the newspaper. So you get random tidbits about, Miss So-and-so traveled home to this city over the weekend and all of these other things like that. But I read newspapers because I'm interested in seeing how people in specific regions talk about labor. What words are they using? What terms are they using? How are they talking about enslaved people? Honing in on those keywords so I can perform more specific searches. And additionally, so newspapers, I look at private papers. I'm always looking at wills and estate records, because one of the things that I'm looking for in that process is sometimes you find wills that don't mention, that are very just sort of general. I own enslaved people. I'm leaving them to my wife or something to that extent. But what I've learned to do in doing that research is to look for tools, because often if you start looking at the tools, you'll be able to see that that one person has more tools than any one man would ever need. And so that gives you an idea about the labor that's happening, how many people might be there. There's no reason, one man needs 50 saws or axes or something like that. So that's another way to sort of read the sources in a different way in order to find the information that you need. And one thing that I always tell people is that when it comes to sources, there is no one size fits all approach. You are going to pick up sometimes just the tiniest bits of information in the most unusual places.
That's a great point. Yeah, you have to be creative, you have to be a detective, you have to be open to any kind of possibility. Absolutely.
And you have to be patient and diligent,
Yes.
as you guys are, more so than myself. But I respect you for that. So thank you.
And also sometimes revisiting a source, because I might have read a book or an article or a historic document umpteenth times, but when I go back the umpteenth time, I find something else that then allows me to check a box or make another connection because of some other piece of information that I've found. And so it's willing to kind of repeat the cycle, as the case may be on occasion.
Definitely. And then, so Tiffany, you had mentioned briefly your research about John Quash Williams. So I'd love if you could tell us a little more about him, or any of you, if there's like a particular character or person or story that you've uncovered in your research that is one that just really stands out to you as something that's really interesting, or one of your big success stories in that detective work.
Sure. So I was lucky in that summer that I researched him. I sort of got to chase him all around the South Carolina Low Country. But what really stood out to me about that work, and I have to say, what made that process so easy, was that his enslaver, Charles Pinckney, left behind a wealth of documents, including architectural plans for the house, receipts where John Williams signed his signature on receipts for work. There's a contract between the enslaver and John Williams for the construction of the house. So there's just all of these documents. And I've chased those documents everywhere from the South Carolina Historical Society archives to the Library of Congress. But what was also in those documents, like I mentioned, was the name of the enslaved men who were on John Williams's work crew. But then it gets even more interesting, because what you began to see after a close read of the documents is that Charles Pinckney is bringing in other enslaved construction men. He's hiring them out from other enslavers in the area. In particular, one gentleman I can think of is Humphrey Summers, who goes on to become a well-known Charleston contractor. But Summers does the roof on the Pinckney Mansion, and then Summers brings with him an enslaved work crew of roofers. So there's this, keep pulling at that thread, and the story keeps unraveling, and you begin to find more information. But that story really stuck with me because up until that point in my graduate school career, I had only done work at post-emancipation. I studied Black schools post-emancipation. So here I was in a different city than my usual studies, a completely different century. But yeah, it will always, that will always be the project that sticks with me. I tell people all the time that, it may seem silly that this man that was born and died 200 years before I was born changed my life, but he really did.
Well, see, that's interesting. That story has always been there, but again, it takes up people like you, especially you, Tiffany, more specifically in this particular case, to want to do the research to tell the story of that man, of that person, and put it into the narrative. And that's what we deal with today, the resistance to all that we do, and we just gotta keep it on.
I mean, I have a very similar experience with the sort of, one of the kind of defining stories or projects or people. And that would be with my work on the free people of color in New Orleans. And ultimately, I came upon this topic. I think I was taking a class called Architecture in the Age of Revolution. And so I wanted to write a paper on, to see if there was any influence on the architecture of New Orleans caused by the Haitian Revolution. Well, yes, hello. And with the influx of immigrants from Saint-Domingue, both Black and white. And as I said, I grew up in Louisiana, and I never had really studied or been taught about the architecture of Louisiana to a certain extent, and definitely not Creole architecture and Black Creole architecture. And so in the course of writing this paper, and so I'm looking at the secondary source material and saying, well, okay, there's already a story here, but so, what more is there? So who are these people? And then, I had a friend that said, well, okay, if you're doing this work, then this is what you should write your dissertation on, and finding out who these people are. And ultimately that got me to the focus on the Doliol and Soulier families. And there's this wide story, and I mean, just this broad story, and the broad work is on the free people of color, using these two families as case studies, but there are numerous other families and individuals that I could have studied in a very similar and specific way, looking at where they lived, how they lived, what they were building at various points in times, their relationships, not only with other builders, but their stature in the community of color, in the gens de couleur libre community in New Orleans, and their relationships with other constituents or residents of New Orleans in the antebellum era. And so I just found that very fascinating. And then the continued work with that, there are Doliol descendants who are still in New Orleans. And then the Soulier family seemingly disappeared, but maybe about a year after I wrote my dissertation and defended it, I had an email out of the blue from a Soulier descendant in Paris who had found my dissertation, and so was able to make that connection, and am continuing to do research on the family history with him. And so that's been amazing. And, basically having, as we already talked about, the buildings that these people built serve as artifacts, because I didn't have any, or portraits really, because I didn't have any images of those people. And then being able to actually get photographs of members of the Soulier family later in life, of course, after they had immigrated to France and stayed there, never coming back to the United States. But that was just something that was very rewarding. And, I just kind of felt like part of the family too. And so just really developing that relationship and continuing to research individuals in that way in a lot of the work that I'm doing to explore builders in Austin and in Texas currently. So really continuing those studies and that methodology that I developed to study those builders.
Wow, that's amazing. And then Joe, in your work at Magnolia or other places, are there ever specific characters that you interpret or specific people that you
well, staying close to home in Charleston, South Carolina, when we look at the use of the the badges, slave badges.
Oh, okay.
You know, that would the enslaved people would have to keep in their possession to show that they're qualified or capable of doing what that badge says that they are. A lot of these people were carpenters and builders, and those badges listed them as such. In fact, you know, in the city of Charleston itself, you know, 11 years ago when I started this project, I had slavery relegated to plantations in the South, and you know, rightfully so. You know, as that revisionist history that I told you, that was taught to me. Well, that's not wrong. It's just incomplete. What I was missing was right there, staring me in the face. Slavery that existed in cities. You know, urban slavery. There were some enslavers living in the city whose their income, their sole income, was renting out their enslaved people. So in that, they wanted these enslaved people to be qualified for someone to rent them out for the purpose of why they're being rented. Well, a part of justifying all that, or accounting for all that, was the badge, slave badges, which was quite popular in Charleston, South Carolina. It is said that if you find a slave badge from anywhere else, it's fake. So it was this system. Now, it also shows that the city was in on it also, because they were benefiting from the fact that these enslavers had to go to this central point, the courthouse or wherever the records were kept, to purchase these badges. So they, you know, they were making money there. The enslavers were buying the badges. So they were always factoring into the economy that existed there in Charleston, South Carolina. And when you look at Charleston, 1850 and before, and if you look at all those buildings that now exist and the ones that used to exist, you know, there are a lot of fires in Charleston, and it's debatable how most of these fires started. But you have to factor in that a lot of these buildings that exist today have the embodied energy and certainly the stolen labor of those enslaved people who, you know, who built those, physically built those places. So, you know, slave badges is that testimonial to that existence of these people with all the talent to build the antebellum city of Charleston, South Carolina.
Oh, I was not super familiar with the Charleston badge system. That's fascinating that the city is making income off of these basically licenses to be hired out. That's fascinating. And I know, yeah, we've touched on a little bit about like anger or frustration. Not to get everybody upset, but what are some maybe misconceptions that you see people have in reaction to your work, or what are some myths that you wish were dispelled? We've talked about, you know, the idea of, oh, were people nice slave owners? Oh, it really wasn't so bad. What are some other things that you're trying to dispel in your work?
I would say for me, the myth that I'm most trying to dispel is this idea that it's too hard to do that type of material culture research to find Black makers. And I'm always telling people, well, it's not too hard, it's just different, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with being different, or, you know, or taking different research approaches and things like that. So that's one thing that I'm always stressing to people, is that the work can be done. But you may have to call in, I don't know, an expert or something of that extent, but it can definitely be done. And there are people who do it every day.
I mean, sometimes you just have to be more diligent, you know, and or willing to jump down the rabbit hole and fall for a while. You know, I mean, because it's there, especially if we're talking about the archives. It's so much that the archive has silenced by virtue of, you know, what we have chosen to extract from it. So you're absolutely right, Tiffany, with that. And with what we're trying to dispel, for me, everything. that we've been taught, especially about building, how and why buildings have gotten here. The number of people that were seriously upset when Michelle Obama said, you know, I live in a house that slaves built, that enslaved people built. Yes, and it's amazing to me to realize how many people just don't, you know, face the fact that the fabric of America was, you know, constructed on the backs of enslaved people. Yeah, that just fascinates me.
Yeah, I think one thing, a commonly made mistake, is that sometimes we use the material culture to misinterpret. And here's the example. Here's what I mean by that. Sometimes you can go into a slave dwelling and see it adorned with things that would not have been historically there, or used by enslaved people. In other words, we try to fit a square peg into a round hole. We're trying to, again, make these enslavers seem benevolent and good slave owners. And we put these materials in these slave dwellings, and they historically were not there. Now, I think my biggest challenge and my biggest, what I'm trying to dispel the most is, you know, I tell people I've gone to 25 states in the District of Columbia spending nights in slave dwellings. Of course I have. And when I tell people that 8 of those states were northern states, that's the pushback. I get a lot of pushback because there are a lot of northerners who wanted to keep it a southern thing. And you know, they're somewhat justified in that, because it did take a civil war to end that institution in the southern states and the ratification of the 13th Amendment. But I have to take these northerners a little further back in their history, you know, before the revolution, because a lot of those southern states before the revolution enslaved people. And it was not until after the revolution that they started legislatively abolishing slavery within their ranks. And most of those states did it gradually, because those enslavers had to get their money's worth. And all the rules said that was you could not own them anymore. Didn't say you couldn't sell them down south to recoup your investment. And we got to consider this: even after those states abolished slavery within the ranks, within their boundaries, they were still complicit, because they're still on the insurance companies, the banks, the ships bringing them in, and the factories adding value to the cotton, making more material culture.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a topic dear to my heart, having northern states recognize that it was a national problem, not just a southern problem. And that's something in the Pieces of History exhibit. We talk a lot about trade networks and how all the cotton is getting sold to the northern market, and northern merchants are getting rich selling fancy things to white enslavers in the South. So yeah, I think that's a really important thing, to look at it holistically on a national scale. So I think we're almost out of time. We're going to shift to questions soon, but just to, I guess, end on a more uplifting note, what are your hopes, goals, ambitions for the future? Where would you love to see the field going, whether it's, you know, practically, or, you know, if your wildest dreams came true, what would you love to see happen?
I would love to see more inclusive interpretations in museum exhibitions. I would love for patrons of color to be able to go in and see themselves reflected in the exhibits that museums host. And I would love for the field to, you know, so often you hear, well, we can't tell that story because we don't have the evidence. But in my opinion, the missing evidence is part of the story, because now you can talk about why you don't have it, which is systemic racism, archival collecting practices, all of these other things. So yeah, those are my sort of two big, you know, big goals or hopes for the future.
Yeah. One of my goals is to continue to see, and I've been encouraged recently, but to continue to see, you know, relationships between preservationists, consultants, academics, public historians, historic preservationists, specifically so that more of these stories can reach broader public audiences. Because whether we're a historic preservationist or professor at a school, I think all of this is public history. And I've just been really encouraged by some of the projects and the work that guys like Joe, or we have, the work of Tiffany's Black Craftspeople project that is really working to sort of demystify. And I'm a college professor, as is Dr. Moman, but sort of academicize a lot of this information, because sometimes it's only for a specific audience, or the methodologies or the pedagogies that we use, and being able to share this information with the general public and have that knowledge out there just increases our knowledge of our collective American history, and maybe can encourage some of the conversations to dispel some of these myths that we've talked about. And so I think I definitely would like to see more of that interaction and increased efforts in programming to make that information more readily available and accessible.
Wow. So I should have gone before the two of you did your thing. You gave your wrap up in that manner. But I think we've got just a thing, Dr. Dudley. We got just a thing. I just before this this session that we're doing right now, I had a call with my conference committee, Slave Dwelling Project Conference Committee, September 29th through October 2nd, digital. And up until that point, my confidence was low, because we're talking about a digital conference. And we've got this platform that throwing all these technical terms at me that, just going over my head. Well, now we've got a young mind that was there on the phone call today for the first time, and she was catching it all, and she was just giving it back as it was being given to her. So now my confidence level is back. So, Dr. Dudley, we're in this place right now where we're going to bring all these people together. This is going to be our 6th conference, and we are proud of the fact that we bring together all these different disciplines, all these different genres, all these different sciences. We bring the property owners, we bring the scholars, we bring the everyday people, the archaeologists, the archivists. Everyday people just interested in this subject matter. We bring them all together to talk about this subject of preservation and changing the narrative, and talking about the people whose stories weren't told, up until a certain point in this history. This year, we're going to throw in the fact that there's a resistance to what we do. We're going to throw that all in the mix. So that's what our accomplishment is going to be immediately, something that we can control, something that we can handle. I hope that you guys are going to, register for the conference, our goal. And I think we can make that goal again. Since this call today, we want our registration to open somewhere around July 1st. And we think we can make that goal of doing just that.
Okay.
So briefly, I just want to say there's a great momentum that's happening, but in order to keep that momentum going, having those younger people, I think, is increasingly important. But your representation is important, is the ultimate thing that I want to get at, and to have people of diverse backgrounds know that they can pursue careers as academics, as public historians, and that they don't necessarily have to go through the more traditional methods, or that they can go through more roundabout pathways to being able to do this kind of work. And whether you're the college professor with degrees, or if you're the community activist, that your work and that your contributions to this work is valid and very much needed.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yes, absolutely. And I like how we touched on, I feel like if you're in the museum or academic world, we can feel kind of siloed, where everybody has their own expertise. But I think absolutely we all need to collaborate and learn from each other's different skill sets. I am not a historic preservation professional. I don't have the building documentation skills that some of y'all might have, but I love learning from you anyway. And so we're going to move to the Q&A, and audience, again, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A widget on the bottom. And first, just a practical one. Joe, you mentioned your upcoming conference. If people want to learn about that when you're open registration, is that going to be on your website with the Slave Dwelling Project?
Yes, it will be on the website and whatever social media means that we use, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Not doing TikTok and Snapchat. My daughter said that's not my lane, so stay out of that. So.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know about museum TikTok. I don't know if that's flourishing yet. Okay, all right, here's a practical one. Please speak to the word catenation. Somebody may have used that. What does that mean?
Can you repeat that word again?
Catenation?
I didn't use that. That's too big.
No? Okay. All right, we'll move on. Does the Craftsman database include New York State?
We are actually expanding into New York right now. So
Hey.
we have 2 interns this summer who are busy finding Black craftspeople in New York. They have found some really great examples, and I'm not going to give them away because I want the students that found them to tell those stories, but they have found some really good stuff in New York.
Well, hey, and anything that you can share, I'm going to New York next month, twice. And I'm going to Phillipsburg Manor and the Van Cortlandt House, both in the Hudson Valley. So anything that we can overlay with all the research that you've done, and it's Teachers Institute. So it's an NEH grant. So anything that you can share with me that I can share with them, that would be great.
Absolutely.
All right. Here's another, this is, I guess, a question for Joe. Do you have any examples of those badges that you could show us, or do you know where people could see an example of one?
I don't personally know. I wish I did have that in.
Are they in a
collection? But I
like
do have bricks
with
finger marks. See, I put my finger right in there, almost a whole hand. No, I don't have those in my collection. Those are valuable stuff, and so that's the short answer is no, I don't.
Okay. So
the Charleston Museum has a big collection.
Okay.
If you go to their website, I think some of those badges or images of them have been digitized.
Okay, great. Yeah, Charleston Museum. That's a good resource to consult. And now we have some questions about kind of documents and research sources. Have any of you used the Freedmen's Bureau records to make connections to specific people?
I have used them to research, but I haven't actually been able to make any connections in the projects, but I do consult them, hoping that I can and will continue to do so, but I haven't actually been able to tie any of those documents to specific places or people that I'm studying. Okay. Not yet.
Not yet. And then another one, this is a little esoteric. I kind of like the painting this person the picture this person is painting for us. Have you ever read a historical document, then visited a space related to that document, like a structure or landscape, and then after walking where the ancestors walked, gained a new understanding once you had that contextual information?
Oh, absolutely. Part of my work as a preservationist and part of what we do at the BCDA, one of our things we tell people to do is just go. And now that it's a little bit easier to go than it has been for the past year, we are definitely out and about. But absolutely, one of my, I love old churches, old African-American churches and cemeteries. And so I've probably been to every one that I can find in the Middle Tennessee area. But definitely in visiting those sites, thinking about the builders, thinking about grave markers, and those grave markers that you can tell are, made just by average folks. They weren't professionally made or anything like that. And I visited iron furnaces here, remnants of iron furnaces here in Tennessee recently. So yeah, I'm a big proponent of going out, seeing what's left and experiencing that space and thinking about that landscape and thinking about what happened there.
I'm generally attuned to the places and spaces that I have visited. And sometimes I feel like, that maybe there was a calling, or, maybe even the ancestors moving through me from, my grandmother, my grandfather, or great grandfather supposedly built the house, or in pieces. And in the back room, there was this wallpaper, but it had newspaper on the back of it. And it was kind of fascinated me when I was little, and I probably would have gotten in trouble for it at the time, but I used to peel the wallpaper off the wall. And at one time I had a collection of that. I don't remember what happened to it, but, very physically, being in that space and thinking about, why is this here? Why did it look like it looked at that time? And so I think that maybe I kind of always was maybe meant to do this, even though it got to it in a very roundabout path. But even in, understanding and learning about a space and going to it and having that connection, but sometimes even revisiting a space or maybe a place that I've been to umpteen times, but finding that specific piece of information, the names of the people who inhabit it, the person whose fingerprints that I've seen on that brick in that site. Now I know whose fingerprints those were. It definitely adds something and creates even more of a connection to those spaces and places.
Well, me kind of sort of in a roundabout way. And I'm referring to my high school days and sitting in a class and halfway listening and reading parts of the Helen Keller story. I'm sorry, wrong person. Anne Frank story.
Oh, okay.
I visited both sites, but the Anne Frank story stands out more for me because it was my epiphany into doing what I do, my portal, if you will. Being lucky enough to have gone into that space in Amsterdam where she hid from the Germans, and making that space relate to that time in that class where that teacher was trying so hard to put it in my head, the importance of this space. It was not until I was in the space that I understood. And what also I understood was the fact that, spaces have to exist to allow people to come and feel what I felt, or allow people to come and feel whatever they want to feel in these spaces. Just yesterday, I went in to work on my day off because I got this call from a group, the group leader who was bringing a group of children that were, he said, well, this is the type of group, if we don't reach these children now, we may lose them right here in this place. They could go and be a menace to society. And I said, sir, I'm going to come in, it's my day off, and I'm not going to charge you anything. I just got to get permission from the site itself to come bring in the group and get the charges reduced and everything. Anyway, they came. And I was so impressed by the group because I was expecting, no questions, kids just trying to, let's get over with it. But it was not that. The kids were asking questions, real questions. And then the group went in and two young ladies came out. And one young lady expressed her experience inside the space as being, kind of, well, I'm glad this space exists because I can kind of, see that our people were had some agency. They persevered, they persisted. Well, the other young lady came out with kind of just the opposite. She saw torture. She felt torture. And I got to explain to the group, I see that the two of you experience this place in different ways. Your feelings are different, but you feel something because the place is there. The place is there for you to go in and feel whatever you want to feel. So I think that, that stresses the importance of saving such places. And all the places that we save are not going to be the iconic feel-good place. But we got to save those places also that, help us to tell a complete story.
Definitely. That's a beautiful reflection. I think that's what it's all about, is the power of actually encountering historic places and things. So we have a few more questions. We'll just do these real rapid fire. Do you know about any businesses started by formerly enslaved people in building or construction that are still around? Are there any long-running firms like that?
Sure. The one that immediately comes to mind is McKissick and McKissick Architects.
Okay.
They built, I'm in the Middle Tennessee area, so they built buildings all across the city of Nashville. And I believe that they might have even had a part in building the African American Smithsonian Museum in DC recently.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And they learned, go ahead, Terry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that's the exact example I was going to give.
Okay, McKissick and McKissick. Look them up. All right, and our very last question. Have you thought about ways to expand? Oh, my question disappeared. Have you thought about ways, I guess, to expand crafts or trades training in the Black community? This person mentioned green jobs. Like, what are ways you can continue this craftsmanship tradition?
There are, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the American College of the Building Arts in Charleston, where students can enroll there and learn the historical ways of doing building arts and crafts and things like that. And I would say that there are still so many, I'm a part of the Smithsonian's African American Craft Initiative, and there are still so many African American craftspeople that are out there that are making, creating. They haven't gone anywhere. You can still, buy things that they make and things like that.
There's a group called HistoriCorps based in Colorado. They go to historic sites and they help restore buildings. I've been fortunate enough to be on one of their building sites in Virginia, Berryville, Virginia. So there's that opportunity for anyone to, kind of take part in that. I also participated in a program at Montpelier, the home of James Madison, which just this week, guys, they made a historic move. Now, descendants of the enslaved people are on the board at this presidential site.
Yeah, that's huge.
That's the tip of the spear there. So I had the pleasure of going there, and we built a cabin from the ground up. And that was so that was quite exciting. I'm hoping that we could do that again in the future. I got to communicate with my folks at Montpelier. It's been a minute, now that they have more people looking like me on the board. Maybe we can do more of that. So yeah, there are those opportunities that exist.
I think there are a number in addition to the ones that Tiffany and Joe mentioned. I think it would be great to have some sort of collective list or place of those for youth, because I think it's just, having individuals aware of those opportunities and being interested. And then, of course, the certain amount of validation needed, for people to have that interest and want to pursue that kind of training and study.
Okay, well, I think that's a perfect note to end on, that this tradition of craftsmanship is still out there and alive and well, and there's so much hope and potential for the future. Joe is documenting us here. Excellent.
I gotta let people know. I gotta give them verification that I was on a panel with 2 PhDs. So I think that's impressive.
Well, thank you again to all of you for participating in this discussion. This has been really wonderful getting to chat with you guys. And we have a brief survey in the chat for our attendees if you want to let us know what you thought of the program. And we'll be sending out, if you registered, you'll be receiving an email with the recording of this program. So you can go back and watch it again or forward it to anyone else you might think would enjoy it. So thank you again and good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye.